It is world historically unique degree of cultural omnipresence. And this was already building before the internet, but the internet has absolutely supercharged everything, despite what a Portuguese thinker writing in English on an American platform think he might be seeing.
Welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm your host, Rory McElhone, and joining us to help us through the world of politics and technology is Robert Morris.
Hey, Rory, how's it going?
This week's been going all right. It's starting to come to the time of year where when I get home there's still sunlight, so that's always nice.
Yeah, we've got that going on here too, which is definitely an improvement.
So how are things with you?
I'll be honest, Rory. I'm just moderately enraged. I just continue to be gobsmacked by this situation in the Middle East. I guess from one perspective, that of an American patriot, like it's well, we really can do absolutely anything. What was Donald Trump's famous statement? It's I could murder somebody on Fifth Avenue. And people still vote for me. Well, the United States can murder 30,000, mostly children, in Gaza, and it really appears to change nothing. I've talked a lot about how the United States is a lot more powerful than is typically acknowledged, both in the United States and elsewhere. But this is about as horrific a confirmation of my thesis as I could imagine. It is stunning to me that we are 2 weeks out from the ICJ issuing the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, supposedly, issuing a pretty blanket condemnation of what Israel and the United States have been doing. And the response seems to have been, by the United States, a little less surprisingly, but quite shockingly, followed by a lot of European countries. The main response has been to pull funding for the UN agency that's trying to feed the Palestinians. So
because one of them might have known someone that did a bad thing once.
Well, what's been revealed, because when this initially came out, it sounded kind of plausible. Well, yeah, I guess it kind of makes sense that people who are committed to feeding Palestinians, there might be some overlap in that organization between folks who are committed to fighting the main murderer of Palestinians, the Israeli state. But it turns out that this was based on essentially nothing, despite the fact that U.S. officials came out and vouched for it. The initial claim was that 12 out of the 13,000 UN RWA employees that work in Gaza, 12 of them may have been involved in the October 7th attacks. This has been steadily winnowed down to 6 or 4. And now there's been a leak of the materials that the U.S. government, the Israeli government, obviously, a collection of European governments used to support their pulling of funding from the only institution standing in the way of mass extermination of the Palestinian people. And apparently there's nothing there. It just seems to have been a complete fabrication. And it is just stunning. I'm a pretty cynical guy, Rory. I've seen a lot of pretty gross stuff, but it is just stunning.
And I think Benjamin Netanyahu's just come out and said, give us another couple more months.
Yeah, to keep doing this, committing this horror.
And has there been militias moving into the West Bank?
Well, the West Bank isn't something I've studied too closely, but I do know that even though the Palestinian Authority has been bending over backwards to work with the Israeli government for the past 20 years now, the main focus, even to a higher focus than what they do in Gaza, has been ethnic cleansing the West Bank. Obviously, they can't kill people at quite the same pace that they've been killing people in Gaza in the aftermath of the Hamas attack, but it's all just incredibly dark, Rory. And
remember when America used to go to the moon?
Yeah, exactly. Apparently, our main interests now are just continuing to bring about horror, savage horror across the Middle East. That's the main. It's apparently the highest and best use of U.S. tax dollars.
Well, speaking of America, I'm very worried about America's place in the world and where it'll be in the future, because I'm on an American web browser on an American operating system with an American processor, graphics card, and RAM, talking to you over American recording software, but an above-average kickboxer that's into chess said America's declining, so it must be true. Could you please
Indeed.
tell us about this decline?
Yes. So what we're going to talk about today is one of the main reasons. I was actually had a sort of frightening realization this morning that actually the intricacies of the ownership of one of our tech platforms may actually have a lot to do with just how little we care as a society about what's happening in Gaza. But I think on a much broader scale, the internet, how we deal with, how we process information in this day and age, day to day, is very much a part of U.S. empire. The internet is U.S. empire, and that's part of the reason why we can commit horrors like this, have it be largely ignored. I remember, in October, I was quite disturbed by how many folks that I follow had become so engaged in the Middle East, and I thought in a different way than I would like. But now it's just what's so disturbing is it's just nobody cares. Nobody talks about this. Nobody looks at this in any way. There was a great promise of the internet that it was going to somehow democratize information and keep us all better aware of what was going on.
The information age, I remember I kept hearing.
Indeed, an information superhighway, everything at our fingertips. And honestly, what I've been seeing over the past 4 months is a great obscuring. It seems to have, the way that we consume things has made it easier to ignore things that we really should be paying attention to as a country and as a world society. It's, I think, worth unpacking a little bit. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The extent to which the internet is U.S. empire.
Well, I was thinking of how much apparently young people just aren't supporting Israel because of TikTok.
This is one of the most interesting ways that folks have been talking about this is I would say the fact that people aren't quite realizing how deeply, deeply controlled the media that we normally consume is. I think the reason why TikTok, and we've discussed this before, the reason why TikTok is so anti-Israel, anti-Palestine, is because of the social media companies has the least mediated approach. In the aftermath of the 2016 elections, Facebook, Google, Twitter, all instantiated very large systems and very large political wings, technology wings, legions of contractors whose job was to police content to some degree. In some ways that were essential, making sure that certain kinds of truly damaging content weren't there and whatnot. But by the very nature of these bureaucracies that were built up, there was political bias that crept in. Certainly there's a lot of folks in the right-wing information ecosphere who claim that this is all about canceling and shadow banning people who want to say right-wing things. And I'm sure that's possible to some degree, but I have personally experienced, I'm biased in this, of course, but for me, the massive, massive bias that was introduced to all the social media platforms in the aftermath of 2016 was a pro-U.S. foreign policy bias. And what was interesting is that Facebook and Google and latterly Twitter became much more like the old line mainstream news sources in the United States that have a sort of party line, pro-U.S. government, pro-Israeli government party line that they hew to very closely. TikTok is still a new platform, a relatively new platform, rather. And TikTok's main goal is eyeballs. Main goal is making you angry or keeping you on the platform. And the other platforms are more solidified, and they don't care about that so much. They're more about getting more money from advertisers. And in that sense, they're less interested in inflammatory, anti-government, anti-established narratives. So TikTok, not because TikTok has any kind of virtue or real love of the Palestinian people, it's because they want to show you the most compelling content. Facebook isn't interested in the most compelling content anymore. And it is really compelling and horrifying, and just an indicator of just how badly our other media platforms are failing us.
I find it somewhat ironic that I've seen that Israel seems to have, or the IDF seems to have, essentially a troll farm. They basically have ones that are...
It is thus comforting to learn that the IDF employs soldiers whose job titles are new to the military world. The IDF now has soldiers who tweet, share, like, and more.
Spend all day posting, making sure things look good for Israel. And their main thing they're trying to get is to stop mainstream media from basically reporting on them. Because I remember seeing probably one of the most milquetoast, like CNN reports you could get on the conflict. And you're still just horrified. It's just like, here's the most basic thing that's happening. And you're still like, this is horrific. And they're asking very basic questions to soldiers. And you're getting some insight. And it just shows, like, if this is milquetoast covered up as much as possible, what's the true reality? So I think it's funny that we've almost gone so far away from mainstream that we're just seeing, like, here's some IDF soldiers boasting about going through somebody's laundry. Like, you see some stuff that, although it's not necessarily showing gore, it shows such an insight that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise, and couldn't be further from mainstream media.
So you're talking about TikTok,
Yes.
So I mean, what's extraordinary is just the degree to which the Israeli government is not controlling what their soldiers are posting, because it's quite horrific. A lot of the content that's turning our youngsters against Israel on TikTok is produced by Israeli soldiers who are in some cases documenting their own war crimes and posting them themselves. The thing is that TikTok is interested in being inflammatory, but it's mostly, it doesn't care about being closer to reality if that reality drives eyeballs. And the reality is horrible and compelling, and it's the failure of most media in the United States and most internet platforms in the United States to show this reality. A reason why TikTok's coverage of this conflict, as it were, is so much different from that of sort of the mainstream. And what's I think inevitable as a result of TikTok's interaction here being kind of the only trustworthy would overstate it, but the only...
Would it be slightly more independent, as it does have that Chinese influence?
Yes, it is more independent of the U.S. party line because of that Chinese influence, but it is also a business, and it also makes a lot of money in the United States. So I think it's really only a matter of time before TikTok has to, in response to some kind of congressional inquiry, will set up the same sort of compliance boards and relationships with the Atlantic Council and similar types of deals as Facebook and Google had to set up. So this is probably the last time TikTok will be useful for a news event. The one that sort of struck me this morning was Twitter. And I do think, this could be utopian, but I do think if we had the Twitter that we had 2 years ago, it would be harder for the U.S. media environment, the U.S. internet more broadly, to maintain this distortion field, this fog of unreality where, Israel's acting in self-defense.
Do you think it's because people have left Twitter that has meant there's less scrutiny about, and it's more kept more of a pro-American policy? Or do you think there was a certain thing that was implemented that's ultimately resulted in this?
I think it's a combination of factors. I think what folks don't realize is that before Elon Musk, Twitter did kind of function as a global town square. It was a somewhat unified, it was in some ways like one of the last vestiges of a realization of the dream of the internet, that we're going to have this very democratic space where that's top down, that where anybody can reach out and touch the powerful and force them to explain themselves. And that really was something that existed on Twitter to some degree. It was shocking and in some cases really humiliating how these famous public figures governments, politicians felt the need to justify themselves on Twitter. Most importantly, the way that I think the New York Times actually at some point said, well, we don't need a public editor anymore because Twitter does it for us, does the critiquing. And if the critique was valid, and if the critique was shown to be valid through the reinforcement of being trumpeted by other folks, the institutions in question had to respond. But this is one example, I think, for me, both with my healthcare company and with Amazon, two large faceless bureaucracies that I deal with. I had issues that were unresolved for weeks in one case and months in another, going through the proper channels, and all I did was tweet about it, tagging these institutions, and those issues were resolved within 24 hours. Obviously, it's not, horrible things happened during the age of functioning Twitter, but it was an ongoing ideological battle that had to be had. There had to be people in the United States government, U.S. think tanks, like justifying what we were doing in Syria, for example, in Yemen, what have you. And I think with Yemen specifically, I think to a large degree, the U.S. government lost that conversation on Twitter. And there had to be really serious curtailing of our support for Saudi Arabia's invasion of that country. And I think that was really positive. So what happened with Elon Musk was his attitudes towards everything about that platform drove people off. There were 36 people that I, consciously checked in with on Twitter, subject matter experts in a variety of things, for years. And I'd say roughly 80%, if not 95% of those people are all gone because they're not interested anymore. And he filled the platform with automated garbage, crypto advertisements, the whole treatment of the blue check thing. Basically, if you pay $8 a month, it doesn't matter who you are, but your responses get prioritized. So any figure of any seriousness or power that has stuck around on Twitter has simply stopped reading any of the replies because it's all just sort of different varieties of Fox News right-wing garbage or advertisements for crypto. It's just a less useful platform that fewer people bother to show up for and nobody takes seriously. 2 years ago, it was a running joke, but wasn't incorrect, that Twitter was basically drove the agenda for every newsroom left in the country.
Well, especially because it was so incredibly useful for journalists. Quite often they would talk about something as if it was a massive problem purely because it was trending on Twitter.
Exactly. And I'm not to say, I do not want to say that Twitter was some sort of utopia beforehand. There were many, many problems. Many of the critiques that Elon Musk and his cronies made when they took over the place were accurate. But I don't think anyone can deny at this point that they have made the place infinitely worse. In my most sort of conspiratorial moments, I've questioned, well, Elon Musk makes his money from the U.S. military-industrial complex. Tesla's nice, but SpaceX is, a rocket ship company that flourishes on the basis of Air Force contracts, among others, NASA contracts. And is it so much of a coincidence that one of the biggest beneficiaries of the U.S. military-industrial complex just went and destroyed the platform that was most threatening to creating war fevers? That's something that happened. Maybe I'm being overly conspiratorial to put it in those terms. And I think we're really seeing that with Gaza. I believe that the information, the heartbreaking thing is that the information is still being provided on Twitter. You can go there and you can find horrific stuff, documentation of horrific stuff, reality, really. But just vastly fewer people are paying attention. And importantly, neither the U.S. government nor U.S. media feels like it is obligated to pay any attention to Twitter anymore. And what was always in my mind is like, well, Elon Musk did this to make the war over Taiwan easier for the U.S. government to bring about. But I think what happened here is...
Do you think he's overcorrected for accidentally liking a pro-Palestinian tweet at one point?
Did he ever like a pro-Palestinian tweet? I thought he just liked an anti-Semitic tweet, so he had to go be...
Yes, that was it, sorry.
Yeah, so he basically liked a fully anti-Semitic tweet and knew that, and this is part of the sickness of U.S. culture, knew that all he had to do to make up for an association with pretty vicious anti-Semitism was to go out and be vicious towards the Palestinians, to the point where the current guy running the Jewish Anti-Defamation League, a long-storied institution in the United States, within 2 days of his committing this anti-Semitic act, liking a tweet or whatever, he had the head of the Anti-Defamation League congratulating him for his anti-Palestinian policies that he quickly trotted out.
But you can be anti-Semitic and anti-Palestinian?
Not in the current U.S. discourse. As long as you're anti-Palestinian, you can be as anti-Semitic as you want. And the real tragedy is that I do believe that Twitter could have, and this is an interesting dynamic here. When a platform, platforms can be designed to provide criticisms of U.S. empire. They can, when they're new, they do have a potentially revolutionary effect. I think we saw this with the Arab Spring in 2011 when Twitter was a much newer thing. Facebook was a much newer thing. But what happens is, well, in the Arab Spring, it's worth emphasizing that these platforms played perhaps an exaggerated role, but a role in taking down a whole bunch of pro-American dictators. Over the ensuing decade, a whole bunch mechanisms and committees and boards and internal policies were put in place to make it much harder for that sort of thing to happen. The internet is a story of great potential that occasionally actually comes to fruition in terms of true democratization, true threats to U.S. hegemonic power. But I think that's almost that's almost how they get you. That's almost part of the fact that there's some real promise of real change through this is actually just another way of legitimating what is a tremendous tool of U.S. power.
Just like carbon capture is just around the corner, so we don't need to worry about getting off fossil fuels.
Yeah, to an extent. Yeah, to an extent. I think that's very similar. I think there's a great place to sort of launch, or at least look into this a little bit more, as a guy who's been he's sort of the main character of the internet over the past couple days. And he's an interesting figure. I've followed him with great interest since the start of the war in Gaza. And it's just this interesting dynamic. He's one of these guys who 5 months ago I probably would have disagreed with or wouldn't have had much use for. This is a really interesting dynamic that just sort of shows how bad what we're doing in Gaza is. This guy, Bruno Macias, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Well, he's his own thing, but there's other figures I can think of, like say Shadi Hamid, or there are other figures who are usually pretty reliable supporters of U.S. empire. Really are all behind what the United States is doing in Ukraine. Really hate Assad and think that we were doing heroic things, creating that civil war. But if you really have any serious knowledge of the region and what is happening in Gaza, and you have any intellectual consistency and actually know things, you can't be anything other than appalled. And I think Bruno Macias is one of those people, and he's actually a really interesting person to follow because he's quite consistent in being really bothered by what Russia is trying to do to Ukraine and being really bothered by what Netanyahu is trying to do to Palestine, because it is in some very real ways the same thing. It's an attempted extermination. And
yeah, but Ukraine has tanks and aircraft and stuff. Palestine has nothing.
Yeah, no question. There's a real fight between Russia and Ukraine, whereas there is not a real fight between Israel and Palestine. It's just an extermination.
I think they may use the term asymmetric warfare, where you basically completely because, say the Taliban, for instance, doesn't have aircraft or tanks, you completely overwhelm them. So then the only fights you do get are sort of like small arms, because that's all they have really. But yeah, this is on a whole other level.
Yeah, this is, and I meant to look into this, but I do believe that at this point, Israel has killed, depending on how you measure it. If there are measures of casualties for the Afghan war, where if we include however many people the Taliban killed as well, and how many other militias killed, then the numbers are higher. But in terms of direct slaughter of Afghan civilians by U.S. bombs, I do believe that Israel in Gaza has beaten 20 years of U.S. bombing in Afghanistan in 4 months. This is beyond horrific. Back to Bruno Maçães. This guy became the internet's, and it's actually kind of great if this means more people will look at his profile more generally, because he's been quite good at drawing attention to Palestine. But he said something pretty spectacularly stupid a day or two back that I think is kind of an interesting place to start when talking about U.S. influence in the internet. For the first time in 100 years, American cultural power is almost non-existent outside U.S. borders.
Wow. Not in Canada, not in Germany.
Yeah. Not anywhere. American culture and ideas have almost no reach in Dubai, Istanbul, Shanghai, Jakarta, Nairobi, Singapore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it is, the ratio on this is extraordinary. He's got, a couple hundred likes and 1.4 thousand quote tweets. So yeah, it is extraordinary that folks. I think the best tweet in response to that was somebody who pointed out, like, the Houthis put together a video of their attacks on shipping, and they used the Top Gun soundtrack. It is just an extraordinary misunderstanding of our historical moment. No question, there is an industry around human rights. There is an industry around good global governance. There are people who care deeply about the perceived hypocrisy and crimes of the U.S. government. And Bruno Maçães is one of those people. Is a kind of person who's very, very invested in the idea that the United States could be or could have been a real defender of human rights. And among those people, no question, U.S. reputation is dirt. But there aren't many of those people, frankly. And almost none of them have any power in any government outside of, I suppose, Yemen and South Africa. So it's just the omnipresence of U.S. power is deeply tied to the internet.
Well, I've always thought as the internet is essentially just owned by America.
Yeah, and I think that's very true in a lot of ways. It was invented by the United States, came out of DARPA in the 60s and 70s, sort of networked computers. I think the World Wide Web was actually invented in Europe, right? Wasn't it to come out of CERN?
Yeah, I think it was a thing for CERN, yes, to help with that.
Mm-hmm. I think that one of the famous internet governance battles that I remember was the conflict over ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. This is just sort of the address book for the internet, the system of databases that underpins everything about the internet. And for a while, for decades, frankly, there was an ongoing dispute over the fact that this heart of the internet was more or less subject to the United States and U.S. government supervision. I think the rest of the world was correct to be outraged by this and saying this should be more multilateral. And after years, decades of dispute, the international community got its way, kinda. The organization is still based in the United States, of course.
Yeah.
But in this series of stages between 2009 and 2016, a more multilateral board of directors became in charge of ICANN, and the idea that it was the relationship with the U.S. government was severed, supposedly. Like, this was this big victory, but of course, during that period, 2009 to 2016, we saw the rise of I guess the most recent name is the Magnificent Seven. You know, they were calling them the FANG, and then they were the Big Five, and now I guess the Magnificent Seven is what they're calling. But it's just largely, you know, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, now known as Meta, and Google's now known as Alphabet. So it's really, I think, that sort of Big Five, and just the, you know, finally, after decades of trying, the international community is like, well, we've got a little bit of a insight into what's some databases set up. Meanwhile, some of the largest and most disturbing companies in human history have set up, you know, during exactly that period, got to the point where I think those 5 companies are now larger than the entire Japanese stock index or the entire European stock index.
Yes, just slightly smaller than the Chinese stock index. It's outlandish.
Yeah. So we had this tremendous first mover advantage. We remain the biggest market, essentially for everything. So we get to determine what happens on the internet. The fact that everybody speaks English on the internet.
Yeah, and the internet is sort of
important.
English first. Because I remember seeing how incredibly difficult it was to type in Japanese. You had to like hold down a thing and get a drop down and move a thing across. So for a very long time, I think that's why emojis stemmed from Japan, is because if you weren't just a Latin-based language, it was incredibly difficult to use until recently.
And you bring up Japan, which is another point that I really think is worth emphasizing, is just how different the world looks than it did during the 1980s. In the 1980s, technology was a Japan thing, you know, from the U.S. perspective. And the way that the internet has been leveraged, I think it made a certain kind of technological sense for the internet to be the next big thing, networking all these computing devices or what have you. In the 1980s, it did seem like some of the most important technology companies were Japanese or European. And that seems like a very far distant past now. It is, these things are changing, and I think we'll talk more in the next episode about how perhaps these things should change or must change. It is quite stunning to just contemplate the extent to which these U.S. companies control the internet and control the world.
Because I think the only big player in Europe really would be ASML, which is the manufacturer that makes the machines, that makes the chips that Taiwan is the specialists of. Because I heard these machines are so incredible that like a province in China got a whole load of state money because they had like an old one knocking about, and they were so excited that they would be able to like, you know, compete with Taiwan with this old machine. So they are incredible pieces of kit. They sound like something like a wizard would use. You're like hitting like, is it drops of nickel with a laser? Like it's outlandishly crazy stuff. But obviously America is also now wanting them to set up a shop in America with them, just like they want
at TSMC.
It's just America basically says you're not allowed to have an advantage.
That's the Trump move, the killing move that the United States undertook with the internet is in the 1980s. I mean, Japan and Germany, of course, ASML is in the Netherlands, but it's part of that same sort of large German tech infrastructure. You know, I think quite arguably or perhaps indisputably have better engineers than the United States. But by making the internet about these tremendous consumer-facing behemoths like the Big Five or the Magnificent Seven or what have you, they left the incredibly technically accomplished Japanese and European engineers in the dust.
Or it was able to just hire them.
There's that too. But what's key is that consumer-facing aspect and that control of information. In the aftermath of the 2016 elections and people getting really, governments getting really worried about fake news and maybe Facebook is the reason that Hillary Clinton lost Donald Trump, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but it's like everything fine when Obama was using Facebook to, steal people's data. Or not, it was a whole Cambridge Analytica before Trump used it. Obama used it, and apparently that's okay.
Well, yeah, when Obama did it, it was savvy and fun.
Yes,
and when
forward
Trump people
thinking
did
and
it,
down
it
with
was
the kids.
but when Trump did it, it was because it was still kind of a novelty. It still seemed just kind of this strange little thing in 2008 and 2012 before it became so omnipresent. But even before the tremendous crackdown on bad think and any criticism of U.S. foreign policy that we've seen on these platforms in the aftermath of 2016, they were still conveying an American worldview. They were still conveying just down to the memes, like what was that Harlem Shake dance move thing? You vaguely recall that? Like that was before 2016, right? Just the way that the whole world would be force-fed U.S. culture, U.S. concerns, U.S. lifestyles in a way that is utterly unprecedented in human history. And I would argue that's actually a lot more important than simple censorship of foreign policy criticism that we've seen since 2016. It is transformative. I think a lot about the contrast to the British Empire. One of the best books I've ever read is C.A. Bailey's Birth of the Modern World. And he talks about the way that the British Empire didn't just influence the borders and the wars and the foreign policy, but influenced the way that the elites of every country in the world consumed culture and dressed sometimes for some occasions. But what's interesting about that, and that was the British Empire was more powerful than any prior empire in the reach of their culture and their politics and their approaches to art and this, that, and the other thing. But it was so incredibly tiny by comparison to what the United States has been capable of throughout the United States' time in power. I mean, long before the internet, Hollywood and television and radio allowed a much deeper infiltration of the mind of every human being British Empire was capable of. But after the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s and the 2010s and into the 2020s, the deep colonization of every human mind on the planet through these little empire boxes in all of our pockets has been it's incalculable.
I was just going to say how Britain basically seems like it's thrown away one of its key computing partners, ARM, which I think started off when Acorn were making processors for the BBC Micro, as the BBC weren't allowed to advertise anyone, so they had like their own standardized computer.
Really? I didn't know the ARM came out of the BBC.
Yeah. So
that's fascinating.
They made it they made this Acorn computing, I think it was. They made this processor and found out that it didn't need additional power, enough from the computer that it was plugged into. So since it could run on incredibly little amount of electricity, meant it did great for mobile applications. But Britain was happy to have it sold off to the Japanese, and I think BlackRock own it now, and someone else maybe owns it. So while America feels like it holds on to its companies like this that are precious, Britain's just like, yeah, go away. We don't need a processor company. Because I think that's where Apple's based. It used to sort of be closely tied with ARM, and now they claim they're their own thing.
Well, I mean, ARM does chip design, right? I'm not familiar with the current history of that particular business, but yeah, it's no question that Europe is not competing on the same level with the United States in these issues, and it's really hard to overestimate the impact of all of these dynamics. It affects every human being on the planet, and it is every smartphone is a vehicle for U.S. ideas, U.S. impressions of the world. I've talked many times about how, while most people talk about U.S. decline, I'm seeing just U.S. imperial consolidation, or perhaps even U.S. imperial acceleration. And I think it's the smartphone that is the greatest driver of this.
Well, both operating systems on it are American, both Apple and Android.
Yeah. And most of the services are as well. TikTok is this big international shining example of a Chinese company, and the U.S. government and all of these U.S. companies are doing everything they can to destroy it.
Oh, yeah, they've had to bend over backwards just to be treated like a normal app.
And it is, but yeah, it's the internet that is probably the main reason why I see U.S. empire as accelerating rather than declining, and it's every aspect of it, Rory. Like the complexity, the depth of these technology companies, and the ways that the multiple maneuvers. You already brought up ASML and TSMC, nominally non-U.S. companies that have to tie themselves in knots according to the dictates of the U.S. government. That's a more securitized sort of post 9/11, post New Cold War thing. But even outside of U.S. government mandates, there are so many different ways for the United States, U.S. business, U.S. culture, U.S. society to exert power. One interesting is sort of like the whole process of this big consumer-facing technology industry. Like at one end, you've got investing in this, and every wealthy person in the world wants to invest in U.S. tech to some degree.
They want to be early on the next Google or Amazon.
Exactly, and I'm in fact pretty sure it's a money-losing proposition. But Saudi Arabia, one of the largest pools of money on the planet, that theoretically could be, not much in practice, but in theory, could be opposed to the United States, or could be used to build up Saudi Arabia into a more independent place, or could be used to facilitate a switch to China or that sort of hegemony. That big pool of money has spent the past 5 years largely being poured into U.S. technology companies.
So it does seem like the money America gives it for oil just seems to come back around for tech. So it's like it's able to fund itself.
Well, that's been a very conscious deal that the Saudis have had with the U.S. government. I'm never really explicit since the 70s or 80s, but over the past 5 years, the sheer scale, just as people have gotten more worried about the possibility that Saudi Arabia might send that money elsewhere, Saudi Arabia has been accelerating the amount of money they send to the United States through technology companies and internet companies of variations. So that's sort of at the very beginning of the process. But then look at the other end of the process. And famously, YouTube is huge in India. One of my greatest regrets on this channel is that I've not spent more time
talking about India. Oh yeah, you'll get Indians quite often, especially when you're looking for tech things. Indian people will be telling you how to work it and get it done right. But yeah, I think it's also just there's so many Indians, and China is not really allowed on.
Indeed. And well, yeah, India banned TikTok, but they haven't banned YouTube, which is kind of fascinating for a country that's so anti-imperial in its orientation. The extent to which, obviously, the content of Indian YouTube is largely Indian. What was it? A T-Series, finally beat out PewDiePie. I remember that was a competition 4 or 5 years back.
A long time ago.
It feels like last week to me. I'm in my 40s. Yeah, and of course it's mostly Indian content, but it is Indian content that is being uploaded to an American platform and is being, like, whole generations of young people in India are being conditioned to what a YouTube content creator is according to American lines. And there are subtle ways that impacts the way that these creators, these Indian creators, and these Indian consumers see the world. And it's always going to be intentionally and unintentionally, vastly more unintentionally. It's going to be channeling people's thinking, people's priorities, people's dreams in American directions. And that is I don't necessarily think that's always sinister. I think a kind of one world life and society and government is kind of inevitable. And I'm usually happy to have the United States shaping that in large part. But when you look at what we're doing in Gaza and the fact that nobody seems to really be
able to stop it,
doing much about it, or even interested in talking about it anymore, you see the much, much, much darker side of
American power.
Yeah, well, the American power over the internet. And it's something worth paying more attention to.
But also, as we look into the future, the idea that America is anyway dwindling is laughable, because NVIDIA have new H100 GPUs that are dedicated for AI, and these retail at about $40,000 each, which is quite a lot of money. And last year, Microsoft and Meta bought about 150,000 of them, which works out at about $6 billion. I assume they get a bit of a discount when you're buying that many, but there are other companies that are buying around like 15 or 20,000 that are some Chinese and mostly American. But it's just the idea that America is going anywhere. Like, AI is obviously the next big thing, and they're making the chips, and the companies that are buying them are mostly American, that will then forefront the internet into the next decade or two. So it's just sort of laughable that outside of Canada, America has no influence. It's just incredible.
Yeah, it is world historically unique degree of cultural omnipresence. And this was already building before the internet, but the internet has absolutely supercharged everything. Despite what a Portuguese thinker writing in English on an American platform might think he might be seeing.
Is the world just one big cargo cult in awe of America and Tommy?
Ah, man, I don't think so. But
okay.
Unfortunately, I think we're getting there. And it's honestly, it's kind of depressing to me. Like I believed for a long time that eventually the U.S.'s crimes were going to catch up with us, and we were going to have to start getting smart about how we manage the world. I no longer believe that. I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime. Which does prompt the question, Ray, what exactly are we doing here? Is this is just the suck it up and knuckle under to U.S. power podcast? I'm not sure. Not sure I really want to run that podcast, but it's beginning to feel that way. I don't know.
It doesn't, but sadly, sometimes that's just what it seems like. I don't really see many big non-American tech companies challenging much. We hear a lot about TikTok, but I think it's purely because some things that you can see, create a lot more tension than, something that's just running like a server farm somewhere that might actually have a lot of power. Like Amazon makes a lot of its money through its servers that you very rarely hear about. You hear about the things, the delivery drivers, the shops, the things you can sort of see and touch. So
well, yeah, the cloud services are this. I mean, I think that's the main reason why Amazon is at all profitable.
Oh yeah.
It's its best line of business by far. It's driven a lot of its success on Wall Street, and it just sort of runs along quietly there, and is just a part of the growing U.S. empire that none of us can avoid and never will be able to avoid.
Occasionally, the EU is able to make the odd phone company use USB-C.
And we're grateful for that. I mean, God bless the EU, and it's very occasional stepping up to talk about competition and actually making companies do sensible things. And that's actually a good segue to what we'll hopefully be talking about next time, which is the fact that some of these big tech companies really, really, really need to be broken up.
And we'll catch you next time. Thank you very much for listening. The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, what it was and how the US can do better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.